The Apache Indians, once a formidable force in the region, found their dominance slipping as they raided Spanish settlements and established their power. Yet, little did they know that the same Spanish technology they sought to undermine would soon give rise to a force even more menacing and devastating than they could ever have imagined. Spanish firearms and technology would soon alter the balance of power, driving the Apache to the edge of extinction. This story chronicles a period of intense tribal warfare and invasion, revealing the stunning reality that eventually led to the downfall of the Apache people. The Apaches, fierce and resilient, were undone not only by their conflicts with the Spanish, but by a relentless foe much closer to home, the Comanches. What had once been a balanced struggle for survival between native tribes and European settlers would soon spiral into a brutal war of extermination waged by the Comanches against the Apache people. By the early 1700s, the Apache found themselves facing the full fury of the Comanches' raids, a ruthless force sweeping across the Great Plains. These nomadic horsemen seemed unstoppable, their superior mobility and unrelenting assaults slowly grinding down the Apache defenses. Night after night, they would strike the Apache villages, setting fire to their homes, destroying their food supplies, and slaughtering their livestock. Apache warriors fought valiantly, but for every Apache that fell, dozens of Comanches took their place, fueled by their insatiable hunger for power and territory. The Apaches, once confident in their ability to protect their lands, were slowly being driven from their territories. The once thriving Apache communities that dotted the landscape were reduced to ashes and ruins as the Comanche expanded their reach. Families were torn apart, and the Apache were forced to flee, their numbers dwindling as they were hunted across the plains. By the time the Spanish had regained a semblance of control in the region, the Apaches were a shadow of their former selves, clinging to survival in isolated pockets of land. The Comanches' victory over the Apaches opened the floodgates for their rise to power. Having conquered the southern Great Plains by the 1740s, they established what would become known as Comancheria, an expansive territory under their control. Here, the Comanche thrived, becoming the undisputed masters of the horse and bison trade, which fueled their economy and power. Their trading networks stretched from Spanish-controlled New Mexico to the French settlers in Louisiana and beyond, allowing them to exchange horses, bison hides, and other goods for weapons and supplies. With this wealth and military might at their disposal, the Comanches became a force to be reckoned with, their warriors feared by all who crossed their path. Armed with superior French firearms, the Comanche had the advantage over their Spanish rivals, who had long relied on outdated weapons and tactics. This edge and firepower, combined with the Comanches' mastery of guerrilla warfare, allowed them to wage devastating campaigns against the Spanish and their allies, further solidifying their control over the region. The U.S. Army, when it arrived in northern Mexico during its invasion of the country in 1846, found a land ravaged by war. The towns were empty, the highways deserted, and the once bustling settlements lay in ruins, a testament to the destruction wrought by the Comanches. Historian Pekka Hamalainen noted that northern Mexico seemed already defeated by the time the U.S. forces arrived, its people decimated by the relentless Comanche raids that had swept through the area for decades. The Comanche, who once controlled much of the southwestern United States, were responsible for the devastation that had reduced northern Mexico to a wasteland. Even the mighty Spanish Empire had been unable to halt their advance, and now Mexico, newly independent but weakened by years of internal strife, could do little to stop them. The seeds of this destruction had been sown long before, in the 1680s, when the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico revolted against Spanish rule. This uprising allowed them to seize a significant number of Spanish horses, sparking a horse trade that would change the dynamics of power across the Great Plains. Horses gave native tribes an unprecedented level of mobility, transforming their way of life by allowing them to travel vast distances, hunt more effectively, and wage war with greater efficiency. Within a decade, the Shoshone, who lived in present-day Wyoming and Montana, had become proficient horsemen, using their newfound mobility to hunt bison and expand their territories. But along with the horses came disease. a consequence of contact with Spanish settlers. The diseases that swept through the Great Plains were devastating, wiping out entire communities of Native Americans who had no immunity to these foreign illnesses. In a desperate bid for survival, a group of Shoshone broke off and traveled south, hoping to escape the epidemics that had ravaged their people. Along the way, they forged alliances with other tribes, including the Ute, whose name would later give rise to the state of Utah. Together, these tribes raided Spanish settlements for horses, further destabilizing Spanish control in the region. By the early 1700s, the Spanish had given a name to this new threat, the Comanche, derived from the Ute word for enemy. With their newfound power and mobility, the Comanche moved eastward, claiming the vast grasslands of the Great Plains for themselves. Here, they built massive herds of horses, which they used to dominate the local trade in bison hides and horses, becoming the region's most powerful tribe. Their dominance over the horse trade allowed the Comanche to expand rapidly, not just in terms of territory, but also in population. By 1750, the Comanche population had swelled to 15,000, with no signs of slowing down. Their vast herds of horses, numbering in the tens of thousands, provided them with the resources they needed to sustain their growing numbers. As their power grew, the Comanches found themselves facing new challenges. The rapid expansion of their population and herds meant that they needed to continuously seek out new territories to graze their horses and find food. This pressure led them to push farther south, into the vast, untamed plains of Spanish Texas, where wild horses roamed free and Spanish settlements were few and far between. When the Comanches arrived in Spanish Texas, they once again encountered their old foes, the Apache. This time, however, the Apaches had formed an alliance with the Spanish, hoping to defend their lands from the Comanche onslaught. In response, the Comanche formed their own alliances with smaller native groups who had been left out of the Apache-Spanish pact. Armed with superior French firearms and bolstered by thousands of warriors, the Comanche-led coalition launched a series of devastating raids against Spanish missions and presidios in Texas. The Spanish forces, reinforced by troops from Mexico City, were no match for the swift and deadly Comanche warriors, who outmaneuvered them at every turn. The Comanche raids were so effective that the Spanish were forced to acknowledge that they were no longer the dominant power in Texas. By the early 1800s, the Comanches had established themselves as the undisputed rulers of the southern Great Plains. Their influence extended from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf of Mexico, and they controlled much of the trade in horses and bison hides. Yet, despite their immense power, the Comanches were not invincible. As the 19th century wore on, new forces emerged that would challenge their dominance. The Mexican government, struggling to maintain control over its northern territories, began to seek alliances with other native tribes, hoping to curb the Comanche threat. At the same time, American settlers were pushing westward, encroaching on Comanche lands and bringing with them a new wave of conflict. By the time the United States and Mexico went to war in 1846, the Comanche had already laid the groundwork for the American invasion. Their raids had so thoroughly devastated northern Mexico that the U.S. Army found little resistance as it marched toward Mexico City. The once proud Spanish Empire had crumbled, and Mexico, weakened by years of internal strife and Comanche raids, was unable to defend itself against the American onslaught. Yet, even as the Comanches' influence waned, their legacy lived on. They had carved out a vast empire in the heart of North America, shaping the course of history in ways that few could have imagined. The rise and fall of the Comanche people is a testament to the power of adaptation and survival, but it is also a reminder of the brutal cost of conquest and expansion. In a desperate bid for survival, the Apache withdrew from their alliance with the Spanish, hoping to make peace with the relentless Comanche warriors. Forced from their lands on the Great Plains, the Apache sought refuge along the present-day border between the United States and Mexico, where they began a decades-long campaign of fierce and organized raids on Spanish settlements in what is now northern Mexico. The Spanish, though caught off guard, believed they had been dealt a stroke of luck in 1763 when the French lost the Seven Years' War and were compelled to cede the Louisiana Territory to Spain. The Spanish reasoned that without French support, the Comanche would be cut off from their supply of firearms, gunpowder, and ammunition. Surely, they thought, the Comanche would need to stop their raids to establish trade ties with the Spanish to access European goods. The Spanish colonies in Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana, they believed, could be fortified and the Comanche hemmed in on three sides, effectively cutting them off from any other source of power. But the Comanche had other plans. By then, they had taken control of nearly all the Great Plains lands suitable for breeding horses, becoming masters of the trade. The harsh winters of the northern plains made it impossible to breed foals there, with blizzards freezing entire herds. Even in the central plains, just north of Comanche, winters were perilous for young horses. Recognizing that their northern neighbors needed a steady supply of horses to survive militarily and economically, the Comanche sought to provide that supply. By trading horses with northern plains tribes who traded with British Canada, the Comanche gained access to British markets and firearms, maintaining their dominance and keeping their enemies at bay. Meanwhile, Spanish authorities struggled to control the borders of their sprawling Louisiana territory. Smugglers from France and Britain, eager to undermine Spain's authority, infiltrated the lucrative lower Mississippi trading routes. This meant that, far from being isolated, the Comanche began receiving vast quantities of arms from both the north and the east. One report from 1767 recounted a shocking statistic. 17 horseloads of firearms had been traded for a single horse. The Spanish, attempting to surround and cut off the Comanche in 1763, found themselves outgunned. Despite their best efforts to deny the Comanche access to firearms, it became apparent that the Comanche were better equipped than Spanish forces. By the 1770s, trade shows in New Mexico displayed not only goods from the Comanche, but also highly sought-after British and French manufactured products. Instead of the Comanche relying on Spanish goods, it was now the Spanish settlers turning to the Comanche for trade. The Comanche, however, prioritized trading horses to the French, British, and Plains Indians, using the vast herds they had built on the plains. New Mexico, with its already plentiful supply of horses, was not their main concern. Independent of Spanish markets, the Comanche continued to raid New Mexico throughout the 1770s, executing over 100 raids that stole thousands of horses. These horses were sold to the French, British, and Great Plains tribes, all the while devastating the Spanish settlements. Their raids were not limited to simply stealing horses. The Comanche sought to undermine the Spanish colonies systematically. They destroyed crops, ranches, and food storage facilities, sabotaged irrigation systems, and slaughtered cattle herds. In doing so, they left the Spanish colonists in a precarious state, dependent on the very Comanche trade that was also ravaging their lands. It was a calculated effort to weaken the Spanish and assert Comanche dominance. As they stole horses and raided settlements, the Comanche ensured that just enough resources were left for the Spanish to restock, allowing them to be raided again in the future. During these attacks, the Comanche killed hundreds of New Mexican men of fighting age and sold many women and children into slavery. Some of the enslaved were sold into the extensive Comanche trade network, while others were kept as laborers within Comancheria to tend to the bison hides and horse herds. The terror caused by these raids led to the near collapse of New Mexico. Entire villages fled, and by 1780, the region was nearly deserted except for Santa Fe, which was flooded with refugees. Native Americans who had once feared the Spanish began aligning themselves with the Comanche, preferring the Comanche markets and speaking more Comanche than Spanish. The Comanche raids had reduced New Mexico to little more than a shadow of its former self. Spanish dominance was now symbolized only by the strings of dried Indian ears hanging above the governor's palace in Santa Fe, a grim display of power over the indigenous population. Contrary to Spanish expectations, the goods and resources of New Mexico were flowing eastward into Comancheria, not southward into Mexico. New Mexico, in name only, remained a Spanish colony, as its wealth and resources were gradually funneled into the hands of the Comanche. As if the devastation they had inflicted on the Apache and other neighboring tribes was not enough, the Comanche turned their attention to larger raids in the 1830s. In the decade between Texan independence in 1836 and the United States-Mexico War in 1846, the Comanche launched more extensive and organized raids than at any other time in their history. Historian Brian DeLay recorded at least 44 major raids into Mexico between 1834 and 1847, with most expeditions numbering between 200 and 400 warriors. Some raids, however, involved as many as 800 or even 1,000 Comanche warriors. These were not mere hit-and-run attacks. They were well-planned invasions that stretched across several Mexican states, targeting towns, haciendas, ranches, and mining settlements with precision and strategy. Moving from target to target, the Comanche inflicted a level of destruction that shook the very foundation of Mexican society. The devastation caused by these raids played a significant role in destabilizing northern Mexico, paving the way for the U.S. invasion in 1846. In the decade before the U.S. invasion, the Comanche had laid waste to vast swathes of northern Mexico. These raids were more than just acts of warfare. They were strategic attempts to cripple Mexico's economic base by targeting its agricultural and mining sectors. Towns were left in ruins, and the people fled in terror, leaving vast tracts of land empty and unguarded. The Comanche were able to move through Mexico nearly unopposed, leaving chaos in their wake. When the U.S. Army arrived, it found little resistance as it marched through the desolate north, thanks in large part to the Comanche's brutal raiding campaigns. By the time of the U.S.-Mexico War, the Comanche had left northern Mexico a barren wasteland, making it all too easy for the U.S. to push through to Mexico City. The Comanche's raids had weakened Mexico to the point where its northern states were defenseless, a condition that greatly benefited the U.S. during its campaign. Yet despite the devastation they caused, the Comanche's ability to adapt and thrive in the face of new challenges ensured their survival. They had evolved from a small, nomadic tribe into a powerful force that controlled vast territories, influenced trade routes, and shaped the history of the region in ways that few could have predicted. Their rise to power and the far-reaching consequences of their actions stand as a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the Comanche people. As the United States solidified its hold over the Southwest, the Comanche, though weakened, remained a significant force. Their legacy as horse traders, warriors, and master tacticians would continue to shape the region long after their power had waned. The Comanche's story, like that of many other native peoples, is one of triumph, survival, and resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. Though their empire eventually crumbled under the pressure of American expansion, their impact on the history of North America remains undeniable. To ensure the success of their assaults, Comanche scouts and spies would ride ahead, carefully planning each move. Raiding groups not only stole horses and captured slaves, but also systematically killed fighting-age men, set fire to homes, destroyed food stores, and slaughtered any cattle they couldn't use during the raid. This strategy, honed over generations, ensured the destruction of their enemies' livelihoods. After each raid, the warriors would scatter in every direction to avoid detection, only to regroup later at predetermined locations. Their military superiority was maintained by the unique advantage of riding 3 to 4 specially bred warhorses. These horses, unrivaled in speed and endurance, were not available for sale, making the Comanche raiders nearly impossible to catch. When under attack, they would ride their horses to exhaustion, then swiftly switch to fresh mounts, allowing them to continually outpace their pursuers. In the years leading up to the U.S. invasion, these relentless raiders reportedly drove over 1 million horses out of Mexico. However, the Mexicans of the North did not sit idly by as the Comanche plundered their lands. Wealthy hacienda owners fortified their estates and hired private militias, doing whatever they could to protect their properties. Yet, they knew that local defenses alone wouldn't suffice. What they desperately needed was support from Mexico City, where the government could re-establish the old Spanish presidio system and send troops to bolster the border defenses. Unfortunately, that help never came. Faced with limited resources, the federal government prioritized quelling uprisings closer to the capital over defending the distant northern regions. This left the northern territories, with their low population density and vast open spaces, vulnerable to the highly skilled guerrilla fighters of the Comanche. The occasional ambushes where Mexican forces managed to inflict significant losses on the Comanche only fueled the raiders' desire for revenge. The Comanche, who saw any loss as an affront to their honor, would return with even greater ferocity. As a result, many farmers, ranchers, and rural Mexicans fled the countryside in large numbers, seeking refuge in safer cities. This mass exodus left northern Mexico uninhabited and economically crippled, making it even more susceptible to future Comanche raids. With Mexico City unwilling to provide substantial military support, the northern states took matters into their own hands. In the late 1830s, states like Durango, Sonora, and Chihuahua passed laws offering bounties for the scalps of indigenous warriors. The scalp trade, a brutal and bloody form of mercenary warfare, soon spread across the region. Mercenaries, hoping to collect bounties, engaged in fierce battles with the indigenous groups, particularly the Apaches, who had been raiding northern Mexico for decades. Unlike the Comanche, who launched large, coordinated raids before retreating back to Comancheria, the Apaches lived within northern Mexico, making them easier targets for scalp hunters. However, the Comanche were not immune to this ruthless form of warfare. Seeing an opportunity to profit from their old Apache rivals, they too entered the scalp trade. Comanche warriors sold large quantities of Apache scalps, turning this gruesome business into a means of both revenge and economic gain. Despite the violence, Comanche scalps were rarely taken by the mercenaries, as their warriors were far too skilled and elusive for most bounty hunters to capture. In a desperate attempt to stave off further destruction, the governments of Coahuila and Chihuahua made the controversial decision to pay tribute to the Comanche. They offered their goods freely, hoping that the gifts would convince the Comanche to cease their raids. But this strategy backfired. Rather than halting the attacks, the tribute system merely encouraged Comanche raiders to push further into neighboring states, especially those to the south, where they continued their raids and depleted more government resources. While the northern Mexican states struggled to cope with the Comanche threat, their southern neighbors soon became the next targets. The tribute system, intended to buy peace, only spread the violence and reinforced the Comanche's dominance over the region. The once thriving lands of northern Mexico were left desolate, and the Comanche remained a formidable force, feared by all who crossed their path. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating stories from history. See you in our next video.